Hey folks, and welcome to the R&D Diesel channel. Today we're talking about the legendary GlowShift 3-in-1 gauge. Is it worth it or not? Stay tuned. Now, when I realized I wanted to get tuning for this truck, one of the most important things you need to have is a set of gauges in order to monitor things like exhaust gas temperature and transmission temperature to make sure you keep your truck alive running aftermarket tuning. Now, after doing a little bit of browsing online, some big name brands come up such as IsoPro and Autometer, and of course GlowShift as well. Now, GlowShift was way cheaper than the other gauge sets, which really made you kind of wonder how good the quality on this thing was. Some folks say the GlowShift is not a very good gauge, made in China, you get what you pay for. And others say it's a pretty good gauge. So here's my take on it as to whether or not GlowShift 3-in-1 is a good gauge to get or not. Now, truth be told, I probably wouldn't have gotten this gauge had it not been for the fact that I had a relative of mine who already had a GlowShift 3-in-1. He said he'd had good luck with it, and he'd had it for a couple years, so I thought, what the heck, it's so cheap relative to the other gauges, what do you have to lose? Now, from a price standpoint, this GlowShift is about half the cost or less relative to the other brands that you can get. For reference, this GlowShift was only about $180, and for reference, other gauges such as Autometer and IsoPro are well over $300, but bear in mind that's for a set of 3 gauges rather than just one. But at the end of the day, all you really need to do is measure these 3 parameters, such as boost, transmission temperature, and exhaust gas temperature. Now, do it with 3 separate gauges or have just one gauge that reads them all. So what the heck, it seemed like a good option. Now, if you're on the fence as to whether you should get a GlowShift 3-in-1 or not, I say go for it. It's a pretty good gauge. I have nothing to complain about. But let's go in a little bit more detail, because there are some little things about it. Now, if you're looking for a nice clean setup, say go for the GlowShift 3-in-1. I mean, it doesn't take up the entire A-pillar on your truck and gives you more visibility. So if you're really looking for something that's relatively clean, I say go for it. So from the standpoint of getting the job done, yeah, the GlowShift's a good gauge. I think it compares to pretty much all the other gauges out there, from a functionality standpoint at least. Now, I've had this gauge almost 2 years now, and I actually haven't had any problems with it at all. It's been great for me. I haven't really thought much about it. I don't really have any complaints about the thing. Now, some folks do complain that this is a little bit of a bright gauge. The backlighting's kind of overwhelming, especially if it's nighttime and you're driving down, dark road or whatnot. Now, of course, there is a dimming feature that when you turn on your lights, it does dim the gauge, and that definitely is nice. But it still is relatively bright even after you do that. Although when you compare it to, say, a stereo like a JVC stereo unit that has a big bright blue lights on it anyways, I say it's about comparable. Now, from a construction standpoint, the gauge is, about what you'd expect. It's a pretty standard gauge. There's nothing special about it. It's made out of plastic. It's got thin wires coming out of it. I want to say it's like 28 gauge wire coming out of it. That's probably the biggest complaint I have about it, is that the wires coming out of it are so darn thin. Now, luckily, I was able to get around these wires being really thin by extending them with a much heavier duty grade wire that I had sitting around. I ended up soldering all the connections and using a boatload of electrical tape and haven't had any problems since. As with pretty much any electrical problem, as long as you've got good connections and nothing's shorting out, you'll pretty much be good to go. Now, this thing does have kind of a weird startup beep to it if you pay attention to it, but I think pretty much all the gauges out there do that. Whether you like that or not, I'm not a huge fan of it, but it is what it is. Now, another downside to this gauge is that the wires coming out of it are relatively short. I want to say they're only like couple feet long, and they're definitely not adequate to go everywhere in the truck that you would need. So you definitely are going to have to extend those wires. Now, GlowShift does offer their own sort of extension wire kit, but I figured I'd just go to the local auto parts store and get some, 16 gauge wire and use that to extend everything, and that seems to work just fine. I personally like having heavier gauge wire to deal with. It's a little easier, and you're not so likely to break it when you're trying to pull it through tight corners. Now, from a reliability standpoint, again, I've got no complaints about this thing. It hasn't skipped a beat since I bought this thing like 2 years ago. Now, I think the big part of these gauges is really the sensors themselves. If you think about it, all the gauge really is it's an interpreter. It takes the electrical signal from, say, your pressure transducer, and it converts it into a value that you can read, in this case, pounds per square inch of boost pressure or transmission temperature. Of course, the GlowShift uses pretty standard sending units. I don't think it's anything extraordinary. The boost pressure gauge, for example, is the pretty standard 3-prong pressure transducer. Looks just like an ICP sensor or an exhaust back pressure sensor. They're all basically same construction. I don't think at the end of the day that you would have to go back to GlowShift to get the exact same sending unit. You could probably be fine finding something that's of similar specification, as long as it reads the same range, of course. Now, as far as I know, there is no way to change or to calibrate any of the sensors that you have. I think it's kind of implied that all the transducers line up from the factory with what the gauge is reading. So there really isn't a way to change or calibrate any of the transducers that I know of. Now, the thermocouple that measures exhaust gas temperature is about what you'd expect from a reputable source. It's got a nice stainless steel sheathing around the wires that protects it from the high temperature. And the thermocouple seems to be working just fine. I think most of the problems people have with these gauges really just comes down to installation. And if you're diligent about it and you do the installation just right, I don't think you'll have any problems. So at the end of the day, if you're on a fence about a GlowShift gauge, whether it be a 3-in-1 or whatever else in the world they have, I say go for it. I think they're genuinely decent quality gauges, and they'll get the job done. If it says that it measures pressure, it'll do that. If it says it measures temperature, it'll do it, and they'll do it relatively accurately. Again, I've relied on the exhaust gas temperature readout on this truck for, over 2 years now, and it hasn't skipped a beat. My truck still runs fine, and as far as I know, I don't have any melted pistons. Well, folks, I hope this helps you out, and I hope it helps save you a few bucks on your gauge. Maybe the money you save on your gauge setup, you can use to actually get some cool aftermarket tuning, or maybe other parts like an exhaust or an intake, so that you can really make your truck run great. Anyway, thanks for watching. Take care.